I remember the days when my family got our first PC back in 1998. Booting up the good old Windows 95 was a wonder to behold in of itself. But when it came up to the games that were available on the platform, the new computer opened up a whole treasure trove of possibilities. It's partially nostalgia when I say it now, but those days were part of a golden age for PC gaming. How else can I call a year that saw the launches of Half-Life, both StarCraft and Brood War, Caesar 3, Unreal, among others. Those perceptive out of who's listening to this right now will realize that I'm not going to talk about any of those classics. Instead, this video will cover one of the most defining games for the now forgotten genre of god games, Populous: The Beginning. Let's take a look. Populous: The Beginning is the third game of the series published by Bullfrog Productions, one of the many victims of EA's terrific business model. Ah yes, the joy of looking into the games of my youth and realizing I'm stepping inside the graveyard of hopes and dreams is truly something to enjoy and cherish. For some of you, the name might ring a bell and bring up the name of Peter Molyneux, but I have to disappoint you and say that he actually resigned from the company a year prior to the release of Populous in circumstances that might be best described as he wasn't good at only hyping up his own games. Like, come on Peter, really? Anyways, this game is a real-time god game strategy in which you lead your tribe as a shaman, or as she likes to say,
the shaman,
in her quest to become a god. Indeed, that genre I just mentioned above is a big mouthful, and the god game part I really need to explain, I feel. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it being used here because you're in fact controlling the powerful character instead of being the big invisible hand in the sky doing all the cool tricks. For example, one of the last big budget god games, Black and White, offered a genuine god experience. That being said, here you deal with a lot of supernatural and world-bending mystic elements, so I can see why some people might feel it belongs to the genre. So I'm gonna mention it as a god game from now on anyway. But before you as a player get to see all this for yourself, the first thing that you're gonna encounter in the game is its utmost dedication to sell the shamanistic setting. Main menus from games back in that era were in some instances very creative, even if not as functional compared to what you see in today's games. But in this case we're talking about something that aims to really capture attention and does so really successfully. Just look at how cool the art design is, and look at how this cursor turned lightning rod leaves a shadow all over the menu. And don't get me started with the music, the whole game has an absolutely brilliant soundtrack. There's not much else to say with words except that everything you're gonna hear in this video's background is gonna be from the soundtrack. The gameplay itself is pretty straightforward. You control your own shaman and her loyal subjects in order to reach the mission's goal. The subjects can build houses or dwellings in which to train special units, whilst the shaman has access to all sorts of spells which she can use to do all sorts of stuff, but we'll get to that. The base building is almost uncharacteristically lean for its era, since there's no actual resource counter from which you build stuff. Your people simply chop the nearest trees and get to work. The houses in which they live allows them to give birth to more people and in time can also be upgraded to allow for more inhabitants, all of which is done automatically without any input from the player. The dwellings are useful in order to train different types of units. All you need to do after finishing them is to send some people and have some time and mana in order to get your special troops. Yes, mana, of course there would be mana in a game like this, don't be silly. It's mainly gathered by having people resting inside homes or doing something, anything, as long as they don't stay idle, simple as that. And considering that people automatically go into nearby homes that aren't full, we have yet another aspect of resource gathering that is very streamlined even by today's standards. Us old-timers can harp on about how hardcore games back in the old days were, but with things like Populous, it's getting pretty obvious that it's not always the case. In fact, the campaign itself isn't particularly brutal either, if I'm to be honest about it. The difficulty curve from one mission to another exists and works pretty well. Each successive level is harder than the previous, especially in the first half of the campaign. They mostly focus on destroying the enemy tribes, but there are plenty of twists here and there. In many cases, you need to discover new spells or buildings in order to defeat the odds, and to do so, you need to worship temples, which tend to be in harder to reach places sometimes if you can't cheese it. I'll talk later about it. Throughout the maps there are also totems and stone heads your people can worship in order to get various goodies, from spells to alterations of the layout of the level itself, which can make it easier to reach your enemies or force opposing tribes into combat. And it surely helps that there's a lot of asymmetry in the design of the levels, both in terms of the layout and in what tools each tribe has at its disposal, with exploration very much encouraged in order to maybe tip the scales in your favor. What makes the levels interesting is their diversity. While a regular RTS relies on you mastering the game's mechanics over and over again, Populous feels more like a series of increasingly complex puzzles which feel very different from one another. This not only provides variety, but it has the great quality of having each level stick into the memory of the players instead of having them blend into a shapeless series of repetitive tasks like it happens in some other games. One of the main contributing factors to the memorable status is the spell system available to your shaman. The more you progress through the campaign, the more and more spells you have at your disposal, with a large variety of options and functions they fulfill. You have terraformation spells such as land bridge or land sink, some offensive spells such as fireballs or lightning bolts. You have beads for crowd control, earthquakes for building destruction, or firestorm to wreak havoc inside the opponent's village. But if anyone remembers the promotional materials used for the games back in the day, you know for damn sure that the stars of the show were the Angel of Death and, in particular, the volcano. I mean, just look at this and remember that this is a game released in 1998. These volcanoes are created in real time alongside all the terrain alterations they do when cast. Of course, it mostly choked performance on systems back in the era, but damn did it look pretty. All this entire arsenal needs mana, but not in the way most other games do. Here, mana is used only to charge the spells, and in the end you can have a maximum of 4 charges of each spell which you can cast at your heart's leisure. Even if the mana system benefits to the simplicity I mentioned earlier, the fact that you can choose what spells can be charged serves as a welcome layer of strategy. For example, during the early game it's wiser to only leave your conversion spell on recharge so you can get as many wild men for a fast economic growth. It's preferable to leave only the spells you need at that time to charge instead of spreading your mana thin and recharge your spells slowly. Not only that, but when your shaman dies, the killer gets to absorb all the mana left in incomplete spell charges, so there's an extra incentive to be mindful of this mechanic. There's also an RTS component to Populous, which I avoided to mention until now. Well, to be frank, it's not the game's forte, that's why I left it so late. So first thing first, the controls are wonky and not easy to get used to. Not only that the mouse scrolling is difficult, but using the keyboard doesn't help much since the arrow keys are used to turning left or right instead of strafing. And since the maps are actual spherical globes, even using right click and drag can feel confusing. This also extends to unit selection. Instead of drawing a square on a 2D plane like in your average RTS, you're drawing a square over a 3D sphere, and this results in some very buggy and frustrating situations. Since you don't have hotkeys available to quickly select different groups of units, you're gonna need to do a lot of scrolling in the map in order to find the units you're looking for. And that's with only one of the control schemes the game provides, the other one is even worse from my experience. And it's a shame because the part of the game involving combat is quite engaging and greatly benefits from the player using his micro abilities. The positioning of certain units is actually very important, and what you do with your shaman is paramount to your success. So it's quite frustrating to try to pull off some tactical maneuvering and be prevented from doing so by the game's controls. Because you might face up to 3 different opponents at the same time, being able to multitask all over the map is a very necessary skill, which is quite hampered as well. And don't get me started with the boats, the levels which rely on them are absolutely garbage to play because of how bad they control, fucking hell. These fucking boats, man. That being said, there's an interesting discussion to be had about a game this old being judged in this way. As I'm recording this, we've had 23 more years as a community to become better and better strategy games than players in 1998. None of that crazy Korean magic they did in StarCraft was even conceivable when Populous was being developed, so it's reasonable for the developers to not account for any of that wild stuff. This is one of the reasons why it's sometimes difficult to look at older games, since you not only have to deal with nostalgia, but also with trying to put away decades of gaming knowledge accumulated ever since that respective game was released. Sometimes I felt I was exploiting the game's mechanics or sort of speedrunning it instead of playing the way it was designed, and because of that I think it's more my fault than the game's. But what I can blame the game for is by the second half of the campaign it looks like they ran out of ideas and started recycling old concepts. And while some levels are genuinely great, others are more miss than hit, like in the case of the one where your shaman is a prisoner and you gotta rescue her with... Oh god, boats again. Those damn boats, they just control so bad. Why do they think it's a good idea? It's so frustrating, oh my god. There's also the issue of the AI, which doesn't have the problem that it isn't very good, but that it's very obviously scripted from one level to another. It creates a sort of a fake feeling when you realize that the AI behaves in ways that are very specific to the narratives each level is trying to create. On the other hand, it makes it feel like it's more part of an epic story and the things the AI does fits into that to its credit. But since the story is mostly straightforward and the only bits of plot are provided via short text at the start of each level, I'm not really convinced of the merit of that approach. The player just has to deal with an AI that behaves wildly different from one level to another. And also, playing Populous in 2021 with a modern system is an adventure in of itself, unfortunately. While you can play the software rendered version all fine and dandy, the direct 3D version is a mess to play. Just to have an idea, this is how I managed to get it to look despite using every known setting in DG Voodoo. Perhaps if I was running it on an Nvidia card I might have had better compatibility, but I really wouldn't count on it. Oh, and you wanna know the fun part? If you want to run in any other resolution beyond 800 by 600, you gotta put a command in the game's shortcut. But on Direct 3D, there's only one widescreen resolution and it doesn't necessarily work either. Oh, and you thought I was letting the software render mode get scot-free? Well, think again, because any resolution beyond 720p comes up with a bunch of graphical glitches which makes it look like total garbage. And regardless, the minimap's gonna look like a mess. Good old compatibility with older games. But there is an active multiplayer scene, so it's not as bad as it sounds. All in all, would I recommend Populous the beginning? Yes, I certainly would, especially at the price you can find it on GOG. It shows just how good Bullfrog was and why it's just a shame that the company had the fate it did. And you have to remember that this game and Dungeon Keeper 2 were made without Peter Molyneux, so it's not like we're talking about a one-man company here, but about a group of very talented developers. The gameplay they managed to provide is very satisfactory and surprisingly modern in some aspects, even if part of it betrays its age. The art direction and the music are of extremely high quality, and as far as I'm concerned they have aged like fine wine. And as much as I complained about compatibility, playing in software mode is easy peasy, but if you want to run it on Direct 3D properly, go for it, because the effects are prettier there. With that being said, thank you for watching me talk yet again about games from days gone by. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe in order to catch more of what's posted on this channel. And until next time, cheers!